In terms of funding, there are a couple of sources which is not limited, but let's say compared to international competitors, limited to a certain extent, which I can tell you that the local banks, to a certain extent, provide all types of working capital facilities, project finances, and to a certain extent, trading and structured trade finance facilities. But being a kind of a country like I was working in the Netherlands for 10 years, and I know that what is a trading country. So compared to that, Turkey is just in the starting phase in terms of commodity financing and as well as structured trade financing. Rather than that, there are some other new possibilities in Turkey, including the bond issuance, especially for corporate loans. It all started within the last 10 years with the financial institutions and as well as some other related parties like factoring, leasing companies first issued Turkish lira bonds in the domestic market. And then in the last 5 years, we have seen issuances coming from the corporate, mid-term corporates as well. Still, it's a big challenge for the small and medium enterprises, but we've seen at least a kind of a level where it can be traded in the second market. So to a certain extent now, we can say easily that we have a market for the corporate issued bonds. But above all, it's still a problem. There are some certain issues to issue a Eurobond and to go to international markets rather than the domestic. So to my mind, in my opinion, we can say that 80–90% is just, especially for the mid-tier companies, funding is coming from the local banks. There were some difficulties in the last 6 to 12 months due to TL depreciation. The impact is that in the last 10 years, especially the corporates do not have intensive risk management activities, did not experience a kind of an deterioration in the Turkish lira. So it has given them a kind of an impact, as you know, that we are all human beings, and if you haven't seen a disease in the last 10 years, you don't so be keen on having a kind of an insurance. So that's the main difficulty on especially for the mid-tier companies, that they do not, let's say, mitigate their FX exposure, and it also affects their financial results for 2014 and 15, and. Of course, I can feel the banking side of it because I worked for banks for 17 years. And from that point of view, that banks are a little bit more cautious when you feel that there's a kind of a deterioration in the balance sheet due to FX exposures. So they try to find out who has affected the worst and etc. So this given a kind of a liquidity difficulty for some companies who have higher exposures compared to others. So I can say that that is not a full impact, but there are some impact of it which has been reflected to the companies. And when it is just a little bit exaggerated due to political unsustainable position in the last 6 months, it has some effects on the especially for the mid-tier companies who have difficulties to find out short-term liquidity. So we have seen some delinquencies and bankrupts. So this also affects the behavior of the financial institutions. In terms of capital and that structure, there is the capital markets in Turkey is now, let's say, in the very preliminary stage. So what I can tell you that the deepness of these markets are not satisfactory level. So as I told you in our conversation, that it all started in the last 10 years, even for the financial institutions to issue a bond, because as long as the regulations are not satisfactory in that sense, and also there are not enough sources to fund these issuances, you cannot create a market like that. First, what has happened and how is this changed in Turkey? First of all, the pension funds and also especially the private pension mechanism has been set up, and it reached to a certain level that these funds has to be invested in domestic bonds as well. Previously, it was all depends on the mutual funds as well as the excess funds coming from the financial institutions. So now we have more investors, domestic investors, and also this has been reflected to the individual investors throughout these mechanisms. So now we have a setup, especially for the domestic issuances. But how easy to access this? Yeah, there are certain regulations, there are certain issues and steps that you have taken before you issue a bond, and it has to have a kind of a size. So for the small size companies, it's not so easy. So what we have seen, the first 500, let's say, now are in the scope of the corporate bond issuances. The second 500 will see that. It's an environment that you can share your experiences and feel the sentiment in the market, as well as the possibilities both from domestic and international investors. So it's a common ground that all these important facilities that has to be available for a healthy organization and healthy country financing environment. We need that kind of togetherness or convenience on our side. It was not so difficult in the past when we do not have this kind of conferences to reach this information to the right person with the right time and etc. So this is a very good common ground that people are sharing their experiences, and thanks to all these organizers who have participated and let us participate as well. By the help of these conferences and seminars that are held during this couple of days, it is very easy for most of the people to understand at least the current Turkish economy and how it is seen from outside of Turkey. So you always, in your daily job, that you feel that something is going on around you and you have your all domestic information around you, but to hear how it is seen from outside, to just go to the international markets as well as international investors to come together, both from the Europe, which is next to us and always have a lot of activities with Turkey. What we do have also some information from the GCC part, especially by the Sukuk part of it. So this is a very common ground that you can feel both the west and east of Turkey and the funding availabilities all around us.